Welcome back to the Superhuman Resilience Project. My name is Kara, and I'm your host as we continue to celebrate International Women's Month. So turn the volume up, sit back, and enjoy the ride as we celebrate this week's female of resilience. Picture a woman. She's walking through the streets of Lyon, France. The year is 1941. The streets are occupied, German soldiers on every corner, Gestapo agents in every cafe, informants behind every curtain. This woman carries a heavy leather suitcase. Inside that suitcase is a transmitter. And if the Germans find that radio transmitter, she dies. They've been hunting her for months. They have a description: a woman, reddish hair, American accent, operates with unusual calm, and she walks with a limp. The most feared secret police force in the history of the modern world, 500 agents, has been assigned to one task: find her. They never did. I'm going to tell you a story of a woman the U.S. government told could not serve. A woman that her own country turned away twice. A woman the Nazis called the most dangerous of all Allied spies. But first, I'm going to tell you about a hunting trip. Her name was Virginia Hall. Born April 6, 1906 in Baltimore, Maryland, into a comfortable, well-connected family that had, as most comfortable, well-connected families often do, a very clear idea of what her future would look like: marriage, society, and respectability. Virginia had other ideas. In high school, she was voted, and I want you to hear this carefully, the most original in our class. Not the most likely to succeed, not the most popular, the most original. She wore men's clothing when that was still considered scandalous. She kept live snakes as pets. She was, by her own cheerful admission, cantankerous and capricious. She argued with teachers. She laughed too loud. She took up too much room. She was magnificent. She threw herself into languages the way other women threw themselves into novels, with total absorption. French, German, Italian. She won places at Radcliffe College, then the École des Sciences Politiques in Paris, then on to school in Vienna, and finally the University of Toulouse. She studied economics. She studied international affairs. She studied the world because she intended to go out into it and do something with what she found there. By her late 20s, Virginia Hall had a plan. She would become a diplomat, a Foreign Service officer for the United States of America. She would use every language, every skill, every hard-won credential she had accumulated across a decade of relentless study, and she would serve. She accepted a junior position as a code clerk with the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, Poland. Not a diplomat yet, but a foothold. Then she was moved to Smyrna, then Venice, then Tallinn, Estonia. She was climbing rung by patient rung towards a career that she had built her whole life to reach. And then she went on a hunting trip. It was 1933, a cold morning in the Turkish countryside near Smyrna. She was crossing a fence during a bird hunt, going after a snipe, when she tripped. Her shotgun discharged. The blast tore into her left foot. She was rushed to a nearby hospital. The wound was severe and deep, the kind that doesn't heal cleanly. It turned gangrenous. The surgeons only had one option. They amputated her left leg below the knee. She was 27 years old. She had the world mapped out. She had languages, credentials, ambition, and fire. And in one accidental moment on a cold Turkish morning, she lost her leg. Now, I want to pause here because I want you to understand what this moment meant. This was not 2024. There were no advanced prosthetics, no carbon fiber, no computerized ankle joints, no rehabilitation centers with heated pools. The prosthetic leg Virginia Hall received was made of wood and leather and came with an aluminum foot. It weighed over 7 pounds. Every step was friction against a healing stump. Every mile was earned in pain. She named it. She called it Cuthbert. Now, there's something you need to understand about Virginia Hall. Some people, when their world breaks, fold inward. They become their wound. Virginia named hers, and she went back to work. She returned to the United States. She healed. She learned painstakingly, stubbornly, and with the same relentless determination she brought to everything else, to walk again. And once she had mastered walking, she did something that still astonishes me. She reapplied to the U.S. State Department Foreign Service. She had done everything right. She had the education. She had the experience. She knew the languages. She had proven herself in the field on multiple continents across nearly a decade. She wanted to serve her country. In 1937, the State Department rejected her application, citing an obscure regulation: no amputees. She appealed directly to the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. He replied with what I can only describe as breathtaking condensation that she could become, and I quote his words, a fine career girl in the consular service. A clerk, not a diplomat, because of her leg. She then appealed to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself. He could not be bothered to respond. She was 31 years old, had poured a decade of her life into her dream. She had survived amputation. She learned to walk on a wooden leg. She rebuilt herself from nothing. And the country she wanted to serve told her she was not enough. Virginia Hall resigned from the State Department in March of 1939. 6 months later, Adolf Hitler invaded Poland and the world went to war. Virginia Hall did not go home. She volunteered. She made her way to France and signed up to drive ambulances for the French 9th Artillery Regiment, keeping her prosthetic leg hidden from her commanders, knowing full well that if they discovered it, they would send her home. She drove those ambulances across some of the most contested ground in Europe. She moved wounded men through roads churned by artillery fire. She was not supposed to be there. She was there anyway. When France fell to Germany in June of 1940, when the French army collapsed and the country surrendered, Virginia Hall fled south with a tide of refugees, thousands of terrified people pushing towards the Spanish border, toward anything that was not German occupation. She made it to Spain, then Portugal, and eventually London. And in London, something remarkable happened. Virginia Hall, who had been accepted by no government, trusted by no institution, and turned away by her own country. But on a train in London, almost by accident, she met a British intelligence officer. His name was Greg Bellows, And unlike every bureaucrat and administrator who had looked at Virginia Hall and seen only her limitations, Bellows looked at her and saw exactly what she was: a multilingual, fearless American woman who knew occupied Europe intimately, who was fluent in German and French and Italian, who had operated in foreign countries under pressure for over a decade, who had survived trauma that would have ended most careers before they began, and who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He recruited her for the Special Operations Executive. The SOE was Winston Churchill's secret weapon, a newly formed British intelligence organization with one mandate: go into Nazi occupied Europe, build resistance networks, recruit spies, conduct sabotage, and, as Churchill put it himself, set Europe ablaze. They trained her in weapons, in coded radio communications, in resistance tactics, in how to disappear, in how to lie convincingly to a Gestapo officer who is sitting 3 feet away from you asking why you are in this cafe at this hour. They gave her a cover identity, an American journalist filing dispatches for the New York Post. They gave her forged papers. And in August of 1941, Virginia Hall crossed into Nazi occupied France. She was 35 years old, had a wooden leg. She had no army, no uniform, and no government protection. If she was captured, there would be no prisoner exchange. There would be no diplomatic immunity. There would be nothing. She went anyway. She set up her base in Lyon, France, 1941, the second largest city in the country, a labyrinth of old stone streets and ancient hidden passageways that connected courtyards and alleyways in ways only a local would know. It was also, and this was no coincidence, the beating heart of the French resilience. Virginia Hall arrived with nothing but her cover story and her wits. Within weeks, she began building. She recruited, she observed, she tested, she waited. She would sit in a cafe for an entire afternoon, nursing a single coffee, reading a newspaper, and watching who met whom, who spoke to who left quickly, and who stayed. She was assembling a picture, piece by piece, person by person. By the end of 1941, she had built what the British intelligence would call the Heckler Network, a web of 90 agents, informants, safe houses, and escape routes that stretched across the entire Lyon region. She provided London with intelligence on German troop movements. She identified fuel depots and ammunition stores. She smuggled downed Allied airmen, men who had parachuted into occupied France with no papers, no language skills, and a German arrest warrant the moment they touched the ground, out of the country and back to Britain. She did all of it while the Gestapo was right there. Every cafe she entered might have an informant. Every apartment she visited might be under surveillance. Every contact she made was a potential trap. She could be 4 different women in the space of an afternoon. Different name, different accent, different story, different clothes. And each one had to be perfect. She made one deliberate concession to her circumstances. She found the most unlikely allies she could. A brothel owner named Germain, whose establishment was visited regularly by German officers, and who quietly passed Virginia everything those officers said. A gynecologist named Dr. Jean Rousseau, who operated what appeared to be an asylum for the mentally ill and who hid Allied escapees among his patients until Virginia could move them to safety. A group of nuns at a local convent who asked no questions, provided food, shelter, and silence. Virginia did not choose conventional assets. She chose the people that the Germans would never look at twice. And then came the moment that put her name on the Gestapo wanted poster for the first time. July 1942. 12 SOE agents, 12 of her colleagues, her people, had been arrested and imprisoned at the Mazak internment camp. The Germans considered them secure. The Germans were wrong. Virginia Hall, working from Lyon, engineered their escape. She acquired safe houses. She sourced transport. She obtained forged documents, new identity papers for 12 men who officially no longer existed. She even secured 2 French police uniforms. On the night of July 15th, 1942, all 12 walked out of Mazak. Several of them returned to France and became resistance leaders. The Gestapo was furious. They flooded Lyon with 500 additional agents. Their chief in the city was a man named Klaus Barbie. Now, history remembers Klaus Barbie as the Butcher of Lyon, a man responsible for the torture and murder of thousands. He was meticulous, methodical, and utterly without mercy. He circulated wanted posters. He interrogated contacts. He pulled every thread he could find. And one day, in pure, unguarded rage, he said something that would be recorded for history. I would give anything, he said, to get my hands on that limping Canadian bitch. He didn't even know she was American. He didn't know her name. He only knew she walked with a limp. The Third Reich formally designated Virginia Hall a woman whose name they did not know, whose face they could not find, whose movements they could not predict, as the most dangerous of all Allied spies. On November 7th, 1942, the American consulate in Lyon was delivered an urgent warning. Allied forces were about to invade North Africa. Operation Torch. Hitler's response would be immediate. The Germans would abandon the pretense of an unoccupied southern France and seize full control of the country. Within hours, Virginia Hall had one option: run. She told no one, not her closest contacts, not her trusted agents, where she was going. She packed everything she could carry and slipped out of Lyon on a train heading south toward the Pyrenees Mountains and the Spanish border beyond. Her guides took one look at her and refused. A woman with a prosthetic leg? In November? Over the high Pyrenees? Impossible. She went anyway. I want you to understand what the Pyrenees crossing was, what it actually meant physically. The route she took rose to 7,500 feet above sea level through terrain that was rocky and steep and unforgiving. The path was narrow. It was November, which brought rain and wind and patches of hard, slippery snow. A healthy person with 2 full legs and good mountain boots needed 3 to 4, maybe 5 days to make the crossing. Virginia Hall was carrying a heavy suitcase. She was wearing shoes designed for city streets. She had a 7-pound wooden leg that ground against her stump with every uphill step. She crossed in 2 days. Somewhere on that mountain, cold, exhausted, in pain that most of us could not imagine, She stopped at a shepherd's hut that had served as a safe house. She opened her suitcase, assembled her radio transmitter, and she transmitted a status report to London. In the message, she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Cuthbert was giving her some trouble on the mountain. She meant her prosthetic leg, Cuthbert. The old friend had been grinding against bone and skin for 48 hours of mountain climbing. London, not realizing that Cuthbert was her leg, thinking it was perhaps a local contact who had become unreliable, radioed back. If Cuthbert is giving you difficulty, have him eliminated. Virginia Hall did not reply. One imagines she may have smiled. She descended into Spain. She was immediately arrested by the Spanish border authorities for illegal entry. From a Spanish prison cell, she smuggled a coded message to the American consulate. They secured her release. She had one hot bath and one night of sleep, and boarded the next train to London. Back in London, British intelligence sat her down. We can't send you back to France. You're compromised. The Gestapo has your description. They know about your limp. Every surviving agent in Lyon has been interrogated about you. Going back is suicide. Virginia Hall stood up and walked across the street. She walked into the offices of the American Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the newly formed American intelligence agency that would one day become the CIA, and she volunteered again. The OSS accepted her with some reservation, as institutions so often do. Her supervisors were wary of placing a woman in a position of full command, but they offered her a deputy role. Not a leader, a deputy. She accepted. She had a war to win, and she was not about to let someone else's caution become her ceiling. Now came the problem. Virginia Hall was one of the most recognizable Allied agents in occupied France. Her description was on every Gestapo bulletin board from Paris to the Spanish border. Her limp, her hair, her height, her bearing. She could not simply return. So she remade herself completely. She hired a theatrical makeup artist to teach her how to paint realistic wrinkles on her face. She dyed her hair gray. She padded her clothes with layers of fabric to change the shape of her body. She practiced a new walk, a slow, slightly stooped, shuffling gait that disguised her prosthetic entirely. And then she did something extraordinary. She filed down her own teeth. A French peasant woman in her 60s would not have the straight, well maintained American teeth of Virginia Hall. And so, with no anesthesia, and with the patience of someone who had already endured a great deal of pain in her life, Virginia Hall made her teeth look like the teeth of an old French farmer's wife. She became Marcel Montaigne, an elderly milkmaid. In March of 1944, with D-Day 4 months away, Virginia Hall was delivered by a British torpedo boat to the coast of France. She was back. Marcel Montaigne arrived at Haute-Loire, a remote rural region in the mountains of south-central France. She found lodgings on a farm. She milked cows before dawn. She tended goats. She churned butter. She was, to every neighbor, to every German patrol that passed on the road, exactly what she appeared to be: an old woman, a farmer, invisible. And from that farmhouse, from a cowshed in the mountains, sometimes literally hidden behind livestock, Virginia Hall ran the French resistance. She established drop zones for Allied supply deliveries. Coordinates she transmitted to London in her hidden radio, guiding traffic through mountain valleys at night to drop weapons, ammunition, explosives, and money to the waiting resistance fighters below. She organized and trained three full battalions of the French Forces of the Interior, the FFI, the armed wing of the French resistance. By the time she was done, she had commanded more than 1,500 fighters. Between July and August of 1944, she transmitted 37 intelligence reports to London, detailed assessments of German troop movements, supply lines, and command positions across the entire region. She was the first Allied agent to report that the German's general staff was relocating its headquarters from Lyon to Dieppe. Her teams attacked. They derailed freight trains carrying German supplies to the front. They blew bridges. They cut telephone lines. They destroyed ammunition dumps. They killed 150 German soldiers, and they captured 500 more. The Gestapo was a half mile away. They were still looking for the limping lady. She was milking cows at dawn 3 fields over and winning the war. I want to tell you something about what that meant. The Allied invasion of Normandy, D-Day, June 6, 1944, is remembered as the turning point of the war in Europe. And it was. But D-Day could not have succeeded in a vacuum. It required the French resistance to be organized, armed, ready, and positioned to strike German supply lines and communication networks in the critical hours and days before the landings. Virginia Hall was one of the people, one of the quiet, invisible, officially non existent people who made that possible. General William Donovan, the legendary head of the OSS, known as Wild Bill Donovan, wrote a memorandum to President Harry S. Truman in May of 1945. In it, he recommended Virginia Hall for the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States Army's second highest decoration for valor in the face of the enemy. He described her as having shown extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against the enemy. He noted in the memo, she is well known to the Gestapo. She voluntarily returned to France, despite the fact that she had previously lost a leg in an accident. President Truman wanted to present the medal himself. A public ceremony, recognition, fanfare, the kind of moment that history books get written about. Virginia Hall declined. She was, she said simply, still operational, most anxious to get busy. The war ended in September of 1945. Virginia Hall received Distinguished Service Cross in a small private ceremony with General Donovan, the only outsider present, the only civilian in the room who wasn't an intelligence officer, was her mother. She went back to work. She joined the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, one of its first female operations officers, and served in the clandestine service for more than 2 decades, mostly at a desk, mostly in Washington. Mostly, again, pushing against institutional resistance to a woman in command. At the age of 60 in 1966, the CIA forced her into mandatory retirement. She fought it. She wanted to keep working, but they made her retire anyway. She lived quietly in Maryland with her husband, Paul, who she'd met during the war, until her death on July 8th of 1982. She left no memoir. She gave no interviews. She spoke so rarely about her work that even her closest family members did not fully understand what she had done. For decades, After her death, Virginia Hall was a footnote, a name on a citation, a face in one blurry wartime photograph standing straight in a plain dress in General Donovan's office receiving a medal she hadn't wanted a fuss about. But the world has a way of catching up with the truth. In 1988, she was inducted into the Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame. In 1994, the U.S. Army Intelligence Center named a dining facility after her. In 2006, 24 years after her death, British officials returned a royal warrant that had been sitting in a government vault since 1943. It made Virginia Hall a member of the Order of the British Empire. The document had been classified for 50 years. In 2019, author Sonia Purnell published a biography of Virginia Hall titled A Woman of No Importance. It became a bestseller. The CIA named a conference room after her. A portrait of Virginia Hall now hangs in the CIA's permanent art collection, painted by artist Jeff Bass, showing her at her hidden radio transmitting from occupied France. She is finally, decades late and long after she could appreciate it, getting her due. Now, I've told you about a woman who was voted most original in her class. A woman who lost her leg. A woman who was turned away twice by the country she wanted to serve. A woman who went to war anyway. A woman who built a spy network from nothing. A woman who broke 12 prisoners out of a concentration camp. A woman who crossed the Pyrenees Mountains on a wooden leg. A woman who filed down her own teeth, dyed her hair gray, and walked back into the most dangerous country in Europe because she wasn't done yet. A woman the Third Reich called their greatest enemy. I want to give you the rest of the story. There is a detail that I have held back. A detail about who Virginia Hall was underneath all the code names and disguises. When the war ended, Virginia Hall went back to Lyon. Not to celebrate, not to be honored. She went back to find out what happened to the people who had helped her. The brothel owner whose intelligence had helped Virginia map the German occupation of France had been arrested by the Gestapo. She had been sent to a concentration camp. She survived. Dr. Jean Rousset, the gynecologist who had hidden escapees in his asylum, had also been arrested. Also sent to a concentration camp. He also survived. Virginia Hall raised compensation for Germain from the British intelligence, 80,000 francs. She identified every person she could who had helped her and submitted their names for commendation. For most of them, nothing came through. The world moved on. The war was over. There were parades to hold and treaties to sign and a future to build. People who had risked everything in the dark in the cellars and back alleys and mountain passes were left to find their own way back to ordinary life. Virginia Hall never forgot them. And that was the rest of the story. The woman who was called the most dangerous spy in Europe was not dangerous because she was ruthless. She was dangerous because she cared. She cared about France. She cared about freedom. She cared about the brothel owner and the doctor and the 12 men she pulled out of the prison camp and the nuns who fed her agents and the farmers who hid her radio equipment and the young resistance fighters who followed an old milkmaid into battle against the German army. She cared when the safest thing to do was not to. And now you know the truth of Virginia Hall. Before we close today, I want to speak to you directly, not as a narrator, not as a storyteller, as someone who sat with this story for a while and found something in it worth carrying. Virginia Hall's life is a masterclass in resilience, but not the resilience we usually celebrate. We tend to celebrate the dramatic kind, the comeback, the big movement, the mountain crossing, and yes, all of that was Virginia. But the resilience that made her was quieter. It was built into the years before the war, in the patient accumulation of language after language, skill after skill, posting after posting, year after year of showing up and doing the work, even when no one was watching and nothing was guaranteed. It was built in the way she responded to the accident. She could have made the loss of her leg the end of her story, but she made it the beginning of her next chapter. It was built in the way she responded to rejection. Her own government told her she was not enough, not once, but twice. She didn't argue with them, she found another door. It was built in the way she managed fear. She was afraid. We know this. She was a human being operating in conditions that would have broken almost anyone. But she had decided somewhere deep in herself that her fear was not going to be the most important thing in the room. Her mission was. There are 5 lessons I take from Virginia Hall. 5 things I believe she would want you to hear. First, build before the storm. Resilience is not improvised in the crisis, it's accumulated in the years before. Every language Virginia learned, every hardship she endured, every skill she developed, all of it became the foundation she stood on when the world collapsed. Build your foundation now in the quiet when you think you won't need it. The second lesson, name your Cuthbert. Whatever your wound is, your limitation, your disability, your loss, the thing that has been used against you, the thing that you were told makes you less than, name it. Make it yours. Because the moment you own it, no one else can use it to define you. The Gestapo knew Virginia Hall only by her limp. She had named it, accepted it, and moved on. And they were still trying to catch up. Third, when one door closes, don't mourn it. Find the window. Virginia Hall was rejected by the State Department. She went to France and drove ambulances. France fell. She went to London. London wouldn't send her back. She went across the street to the Americans. There is almost always another door. People who survive are the ones who keep looking for it. Fourth, let your purpose be bigger than your pain. On that mountain in the Pyrenees, on a 7-pound wooden leg, in the November cold, 50 miles from safety, Virginia Hall kept moving, not because the pain was unbearable, but because stopping was unthinkable. When the reason for going is strong enough, the obstacles become nothing more than mere details. Fifth, do it quietly if you must. Virginia Hall never sought recognition. She turned down a presentation by the President of the United States. She left no memoir. She asked for nothing. She simply did what needed to be done for the people who needed it to be done and trusted that it mattered, whether or not anyone ever knew. In a world that measures everything by its visibility, there is something profound in that. Some of the most important things that have ever happened in the dark. Virginia was told by the most powerful institutions in the world that she could not serve. She served anyway. She was told that her body made her unfit. She crossed the mountain. She was told that going back was suicide, and she went back anyway. And when the war was over and the medals were handed out, and history was being written, she asked for a private ceremony. Just her and her mother, and the general who finally recognized what she had done. That, my friends, is resilience. This has been The Limping Lady, the true story of Virginia Hall. Thank you for joining us today for episode 7 of the Superhuman Resilience Project, and thank you for our sponsors who keep us going. W Energy Drink and Deemed Fit for Duty. You can learn more about them on our website at www.renewedperspectives.me, where you will also find a code for special discounts along with my books. If you would like to help us in the support of our heroes on their journey of healing and rebuilding resilience, you can look at our Amazon affiliate blog at Flawless Him or Her, where a portion of the proceeds earned goes back to supporting our heroes. Until next week, remember, you were trained to be superhuman. Here, you just need to be human.